From the EWTN radio and television studios, this is EWTN Theology RoundTable, a conversation with the experts of EWTN's Department of Theology. Got questions about the liturgy, scripture, or tradition? They have the answers. Now, EWTN Theology RoundTable.
Well, welcome to our audience. I'm the host, Colin Donovan, today filling in not only for myself, but also for our radio producer, Elena, who has a little laryngitis today, so I'll be doing both roles. Please keep her in your prayers as she is on the recovery, and hopefully next program she'll be completely mended. We're going to be taking live calls. This is always a live hour on Fridays between 3 and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Just that today it's the Roundtable, and we're going to be talking about socialism. It's a topic that's current in part because of politics and the candidates out there who are proposing different solutions to America's ills and woes, some of which to some people appear a little bit maybe socialistic, a little bit of self-identified socialism going on, and you have the same thing at the other end of the spectrum, the capitalism and free market ideas also. But we're going to be addressing this, and we hope in a later program to address some of the other end of the spectrum in terms of social teaching and so on. So we want to look at this question as a social question, and we are going to take phone calls, so you'll want to get ready to get on your phone lines. Our number is 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. And we're here to take your calls. I'm joined today by Laura Dittus from our Theology Department, as well as Noah Lett, becoming both regulars, as it were, on these roundtables in recent months. So welcome to you both. And let's see what we can do to enlighten people regarding this issue of socialism. Because I think when you look in the world, especially young people are naturally attracted to what seems like a very idealistic view of the world in which there's justice for all and so on. And the church wants social justice as well. But sometimes it can take a sort of, take from the rich, give to the poor, or a leveling of everything in the society so that instead of opportunities that are available to all, the same outcome ought to be available to all. So those are all good questions to think about when asking to what extent should government, should policies try to completely level everything in the society, and in the meaning of socialism to determine how the society is run, not just at the political level, but at the economic level. And I think the starting point is, and I'll quickly mention these, are the permanent principles of the church's social doctrine. Because whether you're talking about communism or socialism or Euro-socialism, as it's been called, or democratic socialism, or capitalism, or free market, or liberal, always the standard for the Catholic is the Catholic social teaching. So there are basically four prime principles that are key and that are fundamental in the church thinking that should be brought to all the social questions. And that is, first of all, the dignity of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. So there is no question in politics or economics, in law or any other area of social relationships between individuals or between different institutions, private or public, which should not begin and end with what represents, serves, and fosters the dignity of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. The other second one is the common good, and this flows from that if everybody has the same dignity before God, then there are consequences to that in terms of the use of the goods of this world, what is called the universal destination of goods, that they're not made for individuals or societies or nations, but they're made to be shared by all, so that each human being can benefit from them and flourish. And we're going to go into that to some depth as well. That there should be subsidiarity. And that is, if people are to be able to participate in decisions or to participate in the actual things which affect them in their lives, then the decisions need to be made close to them. But at least this, that they are made as close to the problem as circumstances will allow. That should mean in the family, if the family can solve it, in the local community, if the community can solve, at the state level, the federal level, or the international level, depending on what is the lowest level of society organization that will actually meet the need. And finally, that in meeting all of these needs, that we have solidarity with our fellow human beings, that we can't simply write them off, but that we want to see them better off. We want to see their human, spiritual, and material good fostered and grown, that may help them flourish as human beings. So those are our four key principles that we're going to look at. On the question of socialism itself, then, Laura, what is it that the church has found that we would say that on some purely theoretical level of socialism would violate what the church teaches about the human goods?
Sure. So Pope Leo XIII spoke about socialism in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, and he tells us that socialists working on the poor man's envy of the rich are striving to do away with private property, and that's a good that we all are privileged to have, and contend that the individual possession should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. And so he's trying to get rid of, socialism tries to get rid of private property and put it in the hands of usually the state. And then Pope John Paul II gives us some really great insights on this topic. He's someone who lived through socialism, is very familiar with socialism, having lived in Poland under National Socialism, what we commonly call Nazism, and also Soviet communism. He wrote in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, which is Latin for the 100th year of Rerum Novarum, that document that we just referred to. He speaks of how socialism it doesn't properly understand man. It sees man as at the service of the state. It reduces man in his social relationships. It basically sees that the good is to be realized without man's free choice, that the state can provide for man's good. And also we have atheism at the root of socialism as well. And then this bears out in two different consequences. In the view of man, you have a distortion of law, which defines the sphere of where we can exercise our freedom, and also that opposition to private property. And so what the church is seeing here is that we don't see man as man needs to be seen, as a person who is really of great value, and not just a little cog at the service of the state.
And of course, these are all very general terms and generally illustrating what the nature of socialism is, although in the world's experience of it, we mentioned the terms like the Euro-socialism, democratic socialism. You could think of socialism as implemented in Soviet communism as being distinctive, or among the Chinese in communist China. One thing that's at the heart of all of this is the attitude towards the common goods, which everybody is supposed to benefit in. And that, of course, takes in this element of freedom that Laura was talking about. Give us an explanation, Noah, of what the common good is, because I think people get some wrong notions of what we're talking about when we say that.
Yeah. I'm going to give a list of several things, and I want the viewers and listeners to hear this. Life, food, water, clothing, knowledge, justice, love, religion, liberty. No one out there can imagine that they don't want or need one of these things. Everyone across the world, regardless of language, would say, every one of these things I want for myself and my children. And no one would consider these to be privileged items that you could only have if you were rich. These lists of things are a list of common goods. No matter who you are, when you are, or what you had done, you need these things. They're called common goods because together they make a social condition for human flourishing. We flourish because our flourishing is determined by whether we grow well, whether we reach our end. One can think about an orchard of orange trees. You want to create the conditions so they all come to the end of what an orange tree is supposed to do: give us oranges, right? And it should be understood that these things are means to an end. You don't say, well, I want knowledge and I don't want to do anything with it. I want life, but I don't want to do anything with it. No, you want happiness. And these things taken together allow us to reach the goal, which is God. And this is not a narrow Christian interpretation at all. This is the goods that we need to find our way to God are the goods that all human beings need. One can think of conscience rights, which comes from Christianity. All benefit from this. Okay? Another reason they're called the common good is because not just because everyone needs them, but because we need everyone together to support them. All the parents who are in the PTAs across the world, all of the people who are who start businesses so that they can provide jobs for people, so they can pay their bills and feed their children. They're called the common goods because they're needed by all, and they need to be supported by all, because without the help of all, they easily decay away, as we can see in many places. We might think about the school system in a particular place or some other problems. Now, it's not just the individual who has a responsibility. The individual is where it begins, but people, as I just cited, organize themselves into groups to achieve goals, to support the common good, like the PTA. But we can fail to provide for the common good by saying, and in some democracies, the people who get the most votes are the one who get the common good, and the rest of them don't get any. No, that's not correct. That's how we're failing to create the common good. We're doing it for some, but not for all. But since it's not for all, it's really not for the common good.
Right. Yeah.
Another example is we can focus only on one of the common goods, as when socialism focuses on man's economic well-being, as if it were the final arbiter of whether a man could be happy and reach his goal.
So we have these things which, to use the language that the church uses, these as the common goods. These are on what you stand as you seek the particular goods which interest you that may not interest somebody else. You want to be married. You want to be active in the life of the church. Maybe become a minister, priest, rabbi, or whatever of your religious organization, or you want to go into politics or science or whatever it is. Those are particular goods of individuals. But these are the things on which all individuals must depend before they have that ability even to seek the particular goods. Yes. Well, let's take a break, and I want to give you the phone numbers again: 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. And when we come back, we've got Peter in Fort Wayne. We'll take his call, and we'll continue to talk about these important social values and how they reflect in the discussion of socialism.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television.
Hi, this is Colin Donovan back here with Laura Dittus and Noah Lett, and we're treating the subject of socialism, the idealism of youth who might be attracted to that as an idealistic political system, but also how does that square with Catholic social teaching in particular. And we have a question which sort of is tangential to that, but an important one, from Peter in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Hello, Peter.
Good afternoon. My question is this. It's a real hot topic, and it's important that we discuss this. The difference specifically between communism and socialism, because I believe our educational system has, muddied the waters on that, and young people really don't understand the concept because they didn't live through the 50s and the communist scare of that era. They read it out of the textbook, and that's been changed and altered through the years. And my concern is you go beyond not understanding the difference between the two concepts or ideologies, that as a Christian, what do we do with either one of them? And I think the current administration that we have now concerns me, is pushing, and this is my opinion, us toward more of socialism, which would be my property, they're going to take. Everything I want to do, they're going to take for the betterment of the whole. And I'm just concerned, what do we do? How do we approach this? How do we answer this, number one, as Christians? And could you please give a really intense definition for both? And I'll wait for your answer off the air.
Yeah, well, I think socialism is where the means of production are owned in common, which ultimately means the government makes most of the decisions. And that's why I think you can talk about degrees of socialism, a European model which has been suggested might work in our country as well, of providing a huge social safety net. And there are arguments to be made for that, obviously, to help the poor, to help those out of work, help the invalid, and so on. And so this is obviously an element of charity, largely, but also an element of should be of government concern. So I think you have a spectrum of ways in which socialism can be implemented. And I don't know that in the West, at least, whether in Europe or even in here, in theory and the suggestions of politicians, the argument is made for the rigid kind of socialism where the government actually controls the means of production. On the other hand, there are very many subtle ways in which the government regulations and other things, we look at the healthcare industry, how this is going, and ultimately it may get down to the point where the only way to run it is by government directive, and there may be other areas, but we're a pretty long way from that. So I think largely, in our country at least, it's a social safety net. In Europe, it has been this way largely as well. Communism, even if you take it as a rigid understanding of socialism, I think communism takes that further, where the government actually owns pretty much everything. And if you look at the way, in principle, socialism was implemented in the Soviet Union, even the education and the care of the children, that this was the government essentially saying, this is how children are to be raised, this is what they're to be inculcated, and so on. So we can have strains of that too when ideologues in educational institutions and in government entities wish to introduce their ideology into a culture. We're going to see this, I think, in the future with regard to homosexual marriage and homosexual behavior, as we're already starting to see. So there we have tinges of this controlling even the thoughts and the beliefs of the individual. This is why, even with socialism, with this tendency, Pope John 23rd could say in Moderate Magister, his doctor, mother, speaking of the church as mother and teacher, referring to a previous pontiff, Pius XI, he says there is a fundamental opposition between communism and Christianity. And Pius XI made it clear that no Catholic could subscribe even to a moderate socialism. In other words, to a socialism which is, I guess you could say, mitigated or moderated, but does embrace this principle that ultimately the government has the right to control things. And I look at in our own country where almost everything the government wants to be done is found where in the Constitution? In the Commerce Clause.
Yeah.
The Commerce Clause. I remember something I heard on Fulton Sheen, and I was old enough to have heard it the first time he said it and not when EWTN replayed it decades later. And that is that the socialist model is everything, the prism by which you judge everything is economics. In other words, the society is geared not towards God, to human flourishing, but towards economics, to make the country run. And I think that's sort of where we're heading. I think we're a long way from there, and how quickly we could get there, I'm not sure.
And I think if a socialist position were to be introduced into America, it might be more of a gradual thing than the government knocking on your door and saying, I need your extra money. It's probably more a matter where they would put heavier taxes on different institutions so that the government is kind of gradually taking over different private organizations such as insurance or things like that.
Well, that gives it the cover of democracy because we voted for it.
Right. Right.
This is, of course, how the National Socialists got into Germany democratically, but we mourn the results of that election nonetheless.
Yeah, I think it's important to get a little history in here. It's good to remember that there was socialism before Marx. We tend to think of socialism and communism as with Marx, but the point is that it was around before him, and one can probably take like 1781 when James Watts got a patent on the steam engine. It suddenly changed everything. No longer could you be in your house as a little business having your own tools and having the means of production in your own hand and your own destiny in your hands with that. But now it was a case that factories began to grow up and you worked for someone else who owned all the means of production and not yourself. And we're all aware of the Dickens novels and the television movies about it and see how hard life was, for example, in Great Britain. And we can see that abuses arose because the individuals working in the factories were treated like, in proverb, cogs in a machine and not human beings, worked to death, more or less. Worked in conditions that produced ill health, if not damaging you outright. And one can go through and think of the list of things themselves. To this problem, people brought their minds, their thoughts, their compassions, and proposed different number of solutions. And one of the solutions was, we need a government to go in and force the people who own the factories to make some changes.
Right,
Okay.
the labor laws and such.
To make some changes. And there were good things and there were bad things. And there were people who said that, like Marx, it was get to him, the communism is with him. They had the idea that it wasn't God, but mechanical forces in history that were already working to move us from feudalism into capitalism, into socialism, that would give us the utopia, which is a word that tells us that this is not going to be good for anybody. When they call it utopia, it's supposed to be good for everybody, but it's not.
Yeah. And that was called dialectic materialism, that history is moving forward, but it's all materialistic principles and almost an inevitability that we would ultimately get to this utopia as historical forces work, reaching a consensus and then moving forward. So when we come back, we're going to take more of your calls at 1-800-585-9396 and continue our discussion. Back.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television.
Well, it's Colin Donovan, and I'm back with our roundtable with Laura Dittus and Noah Lett, and also with Elena Rodriguez, though you can't hear her because of her laryngitis, so I've got her mic today. We've been talking about socialism, and we've talked a little bit about communism as well, and how there is this tendency to reduce man to a cog in the machinery. I think that's a very, a very important and significant illustration because there is, I think, when you talk about, you gave the example also, Noah, before the break, about after the Industrial Revolution, where capital, if you will, was the driving force of society, and it didn't look out for or respect the rights of the workers the way it should have, and eventually governments got involved. That's at the other extreme of the spectrum. You could say there is an excess of freedom there, freedom for capital, but not so much freedom for the worker. Socialism goes the other way, where the society is organized, but in the same way, there is freedom of the individual to prosper and to make progress independent of society, of government or larger entities, is removed from that possibility. I think there is a question that actually sort of cuts into this because it touches on this voluntariness. And that is, Stephen, listening on Sirius XM radio, asked the question, essentially, wasn't the Apostolic College, wasn't the apostles, as reflected in the Acts of the Apostles, was that not a socialistic society? They held everything in common.
Well, it would seem that way, right? Well, the difference here is that with the apostles, they're choosing to hold all things in common. It's not like the Roman government's knocking on their door and saying that, you will all be equal and we'll let you know how much that's going to be. But there's this basis of charity there where I think the socialistic government puts too much confidence in man, because you do have original sin that comes into play here.
Absolutely.
And so socialism might be a response to evils that we see in the workplace or people being taken advantage of. But at the same time, there's still that part of original sin that's going to be present. And also, the apostles holding all things in common, it was for a particular purpose, too, for the spreading of the gospel, for the caring of each other. There's this sense of solidarity, of participation. They're building a certain community. And we see this, too, in religious life. You have different religious communities holding things in common. You might have cars, but you might not own any of them, telephones and the like. And so it's all held in common, but not in the sense that we have that the government's saying you have to do this.
No, and even that reminds me of something that when I was studying at the Angelicum, we had a Dominican professor who had been a prior of a Dominican house in Germany. When talking about he was an expert in patristics and talking about the early church and issues like this. He made the point that when he was a prior, he learned firsthand that communism doesn't work, because he said the trouble in religious life is usually nobody puts gas in the car. Nobody notices that red oil light when it comes on. All the things that don't get done because there's this lacking of a sense of responsibility for the things that you use every day. And that's actually one of the points the church makes with regard to private property, that although goods are destined for all, our human nature is such that you have to provide for your family. You have to have responsibility for the things that you're using. And so private property is a hedge. It protects that all of the things that we normally use, even though it's not an absolute value. And so that was a very good argument, I thought, for the failures of a truly socialistic viewpoint.
We should remember that the passages also point out they didn't sell all their land. They sold a part of the land and put them at the feet of the apostles, as well as the points that Laura made. And it's very clear that this is not here in the passage of Scripture to tell us how all civilization is to be organized. This was an occasion at the time, and as the church makes clear to us, the religious can live this life to address their possessiveness, which they're supposed to live in the new world to come, while in this world and in the new world to come, there is no possessiveness, and so they live it here as a sign to us. The socialism of our countries is not a sign to us of the world to come.
No, and you could look at these 4 points that are in the teaching of the church 2,000 years later than that, and you can see that the dignity of the person is fulfilled. They have their freedom. They're seeking God in common, the common good, because they are sharing things in common that are essential, but yet husband and wife are not living in that community. We have the sad story of the couple who tried to cheat the Holy Spirit. But they were living in family life and doing what you do in family life. Subsidiarity, they were obviously doing things which had to be done at that level, but this wasn't the government, as you said, doing it. And solidarity, that was out of a common concern for each other and building up the kingdom of God. So it is a way of life that can respect human freedom and all the values, provided that the effort is made to do so, and it's not simply a materialistic, atheistic, and you could say now socialistic, in which the society is, in a sense, a more significant reality than the individual. And that this way the tension between social and individual is resolved, I think, in the case of the apostles, whereas in socialism it is not. Well, let's take another caller, and let's go to Marianne in Mexico City, Mexico, listening on the Ave Maria radio app. Good afternoon, Mariana.
Good afternoon. Is there a link between socialism and theology, liberation theology?
There's certainly very many connections, I think. When the church condemned liberation theology in some forms, it didn't feel that they were motivated by the theological considerations which guide social teaching, but by a Marxist analysis, this dialectic materialism. So the materialism of the condemned kind of liberation theology that the church condemned, and socialism is clearly there in its sort of godlessness and so on. There's a way of looking at liberation theology from an authentic Catholic perspective, and that's to be found in the two documents issued by Cardinal Ratzinger at the CDF when he tried to find the good Catholic resolution on this issue of the poor in Latin America and dealing with oppression, not in a revolutionary fashion, but in a way that also sees the rich people who are oppressing you as having dignity and worth. And so how do you do that? How do you resolve that?
I think it's important to remember that when we see these problems in the world as the distinct difference between the rich and the poor in South America, we have to think, how can we help, and be careful and choose. And we can't let what is maybe the easiest path to get things done, which is to put greater power in the hand of someone and make them kind of a tyrant over things, or to begin to impose standards on people who are Catholic that don't belong, as, for example, requiring, that you have to share so much or you can't come into Mass or you can't receive, as happened in liberation theology. When these things occur, it's very clear they're using a different standard than the one our Lord Jesus gave us, which didn't lay standards like that in front of people. And we talked about an example there in Acts. And it would do the listener well to go and look up John Paul II and Ratzinger when he was head of the CDF and see what they had to say about it. Because these are not the ideas, these are ideas, but they're not the correct ones because they don't come from our Lord Jesus and they don't lead to human flourishing, as you're well aware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think... fitting in there is perhaps the answer to a question which Michael, who's watching on YouTube, is asking, and that is that he hears the phrase democratic socialism, which seems oxymoronic to him. Could we comment on that? You alluded to it earlier in talking about the common good, and that is the ways in which some forms of democracy go awry. And the specifics of that was that when those responsible for interpreting the common good do so only according to the guidelines of the majority and not according to the effective good of all members of the community, including the minority. How often do we hear this element in our political discourse from both parties? We've had two parties. Sometimes we have a third party going on in the country or professing to follow a third way. In all these cases, you very often find that it's pushing a particular ideology, which it may serve the common good in some areas, but it doesn't serve the common good because it doesn't have this single point, and that is the orientation of man to something that transcends his merely material existence or economic existence or his political existence or the needs of capitalism or the needs of the society. When those things become sort of fragmented from the whole picture, you end up with democracy, even if chosen by majority vote, being not very democratic ultimately. To use a phrase that was used after the last couple elections have consequences. Sure they do. People get elected to office. The office holders still have the obligation to satisfy the common good. And it's interesting that the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, which I believe everybody should have on their shelf next to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, talks specifically what happens when politicians choose the particular goods of lobbyists, of those who supported their campaigns, or whatever it is, over the common good. The name for that is political corruption. And I think this is where people idealistically think, oh, well, if only we were a socialistic society. Or a young person might think, I hate corruption, I hate the abuses of banking, or I hate this, or I hate that. If we only all just, got together and we have a socialist society in which everybody is happy and content and gets everything that they need, we'll be happy. That could be voted in. That could be voted in a country. But if it doesn't have that element of orientation towards the common good, and it's no different than political corruption of any other kind. It really isn't. Let's take another question. We've got Lori in Pueblo, Colorado. Good afternoon, Lori.
Good afternoon. My question is, why is everybody, all these talk show hosts are just dogging the Pope, calling him a socialist, and that's the nicer thing that I've heard. And why aren't the Catholics calling those shows and just letting them have it? I can't believe it. They're just spineless.
Well, I have my view, but I'll let anybody else have any ideas.
Well, I think the one who hears it can respond. I mean, I think each of us have the ability to call into a radio show and to kind of set the record straight. And the Holy Father is not going to go against the teaching of the Church, which, as we've said, is, socialism is not really an option, especially socialism in its extreme sense, where you get rid of God, where you don't see the dignity of the human person where it should be. And even as the Church has said in Mater et Magister, it says no Catholic should even subscribe to moderate socialism. So the Pope is representing the Church, and he's not going to go against Church teaching in that manner.
Yeah. I think we're all products of our culture, and we have a culture built on a Protestant work ethic. We have a culture which favors free market and capitalism, which is fine within just limits, as Pope John Paul II pointed out in Centesimus Annus. But we tend to do, as I heard a very prominent conservative talk show host do a year or two ago, or maybe even more recently than that, say, if you hear the word social justice, think socialism and communism. That's simply not true. So it is a bit of, we are creatures of our culture, and so maybe people are not thinking of what the Church actually teaches, but what they believe to be true based on their own culture, our own American presuppositions. Well, let's take our next break, and when we come back, we've got Bob and Art waiting on the line. We'll take their calls and maybe yours as well. Just call us at 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. Back in a moment.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television.
And we're back, and let's go to our next questioner, Bob in Wisconsin, listening on WSFI. Good afternoon, Bob.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Hey, earlier one of you had commented that somewhere it was decreed in the magisterium that a Catholic was not to participate in any level of socialism. I find that interesting. I live in the United States. I'm driving on a road right now that was built with the collective monies of tax base. I hope that I don't have an accident when I'm talking to you, but if I do, I'll hang up and call 911, which is a socialized service you might know about, where we collectively pay for emergency people to come, police, fire, these things are a level of socialism. Over 50% of our tax dollars go to defense funding.
Mm-hmm.
We do not have a privatized militia. We don't ask for people to. We don't round people up like that.
Well, let me start the answer to your question, since I think you've made the point you're trying to make. Actually, none of those things fit the definition of socialism, but they do fit the principles of Catholic social teaching, such as the principle of subsidiarity. If you yourself, by getting your friends together, can defend the United States, then you're welcome to try to do that. But I think the lowest level of organization of our society that is capable of doing that would be the militias of the various states, or in the case of the entire country, the military of the United States of America. So that fits exactly the criteria of Catholic social teaching and the point of view of subsidiarity. The individualistic approach to things, that we are all just, islands unto ourselves, wouldn't work. On the other hand, there is a legitimate level of society's organization responsible for that. On the other hand, if you take another area of life, let's say water management. There may be some elements of water management which should be run by the government, since water crosses state lines, and pollutants put in Georgia can end up in Alabama, has been an issue with some of our rivers. But does that mean that the federal government or regional authority should necessarily run our local water system, when the local water system, to be responsive to the needs of the people in the immediate local area, are best run by local authorities? Again, you push it down to the level where it's best serves the needs of the individual. So in every question you can choose, there will be some where the only solution is a degree of taxation and of societal organization and government participation or running, which is necessary to accomplish certain just purposes, such as defense of the United States, defense of the state of Alabama, defense of the county of Jefferson, defense of the city of Birmingham or Irondale. There's different police forces to do that at different levels. And of course, there are federal agencies as well. And all of those are legitimate at those levels because of the degree of organization needed at that particular level. So none of that is socialism. Socialism is the presumption that things are really better run from the top down. We find this in education, where the school boards have, probably less and less authority now to run local schools. Part of that might be a good thing. It produces perhaps a better and more well-educated populace across the country. But the other side of that coin is it also allows us the infusion of ideology into the educational system, so that the real value of education at the local level and run by the local level is that it is close to the parents, who are the primary educators of their children in Catholic teaching. Obviously, unless you have degrees in science and math and all the other subject matters, most parents are not going to be competent to educate, but they pass that off to the schools. And the usual legal language in the past has been they're acting loco parentis, in the place of the parents. There are actually places in our country now where they say that no, it is the state that educates and therefore can usurp the rights of their parents regarding any number of issues. And that is what is akin to socialism, not that any particular function of government is done at an appropriate level of government.
And I think too, we shouldn't be saying socialism is not the same as government services. We want government services, but at the same time, we need to be able to have, for instance, in our insurance today, you have competition, which is a healthy thing. You have people, different groups of insurers saying, we want your service, and so we're going to offer you this package or what have you, and say you only have one coffee shop in town. They may not try to win you over if there's no competition. So there's kind of a healthy give and take when you're able to have competition in a society and free use of of funds and things, and also free use of a free economy allows us to have charitable work too. Whereas if the government's in charge of all the schools and things like that, who's to say that we'll have things like Catholic universities being built and such. So.
Well, in fact, as we know with our own struggles with the HHS mandate here at EWTN, it really talks about, it really will potentially co-opt the ability of the church in the United States to function as an education and social service agency when the government basically says you may not say certain things, you may not believe certain things, you must act on our government-directed morality and our government-directed view of the common good. When you're talking about, in most cases, the particular good of individuals who need some service that others might say, no, that's an immoral service.
Bob is an example that we need to be discerning about what the word socialism means and not identify it with things like government services or taxes. Taxes have always been around. That's not necessarily the same thing as socialism. Yes, thank God for 911. Let's call it when we need it. But let's be clear, that is not the same thing as a socialism we have identified. And words, they get spread around, and lots of things take the word if it works for them. But we have to be more discerning and actually look and read.
That's right. And to apply these principles to any candidate, any proposed program of those who represent us in government at any level of government. Is this really fostering human flourishing? Is it really serving the common good? Does it represent the position of subsidiarity, the lowest level that can accomplish it without usurping? All of those questions we need to be asking ourselves and others. Well, thank you and for tuning in. Be back next week with Open Line.